chat and, well, security expert and a lot of other tasks, I would say. Thank you for joining us, Ben.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Would you like to start with a quick intro about yourself?
Sure. Try and keep it quick. It's been about 25 years now since I got into industry as a software engineer. So I started right at the very beginning in VB ASP. I don't know if any of the listeners remember that.
I do.
You
at
do.
least I do. Yeah.
I did that for like 6 months before I found PHP back in 2000. And a lot of people might think, oh, PHP not that much better than VB ASP. It was pretty good at the time for what it was. And yeah, very quickly got into security and privacy related topics. Started talking about like OWASP top 10 at conferences, and started running conferences as well to try and get more out there for the community, and both in terms of software engineering practices and security practices. I had a bit of a stint while I lived in Australia of security consultancy, and then finally got into DevRel. I got into DevRel originally at Auth0 because I met a now good friend who basically pestered me to go for the job interview. So I accepted defeat, took the interview, actually really liked the product and the team already, and took the job. So I've been in developer relations now since 2018, all the way through the pandemic. Always a fun time to be somebody who works in community space, right? And that started at ArcJet about 4.5 months ago now.
Yeah, I mean it's a journey I would like to approach for two angles, but I think security is the most interesting to our audience in general, because it's a topic that's simultaneously simple and not simple to work with.
Absolutely. I mean,
there's a lot.
There is a lot that goes on under the hood, and when you say it can be simple, I think there are some simple things that can be done, but overall, it is a massively deep, complex topic that most developers, I feel, want to have the time for, but we just don't have the time to think about security nowadays. We're always trying to ship a new feature, trying to remediate a bug, and security often falls by the wayside.
Yeah, I think in many cases, especially so, we on the show was often spoken about open source, both from the side of how to start a project and how to help a community and whatever. But I think it's a very good angle to maybe give some suggestions to people when they start out. So, what is the correct approach for security in your company, especially if you're an open source project? In your opinion, if there's a quick starting point, you can.
Sure.
You can...
to be honest, I don't think there's a quick one. I think,
well, there's a starting point.
Though is it's mostly around communication, understanding of the implications. So I'll give you an example. Back in 2000, when I first started coding myself, security was one of those things that in your Trello or your Jira backlog or whatever you're using for managing tasks, you'd have a task for implement this feature, and then you'd have a task for do all the security stuff for this feature. It would be its own task. And the downside to that was, especially back then, we mostly have a culture nowadays of not shipping on Fridays because we don't want to ruin our weekends. Even with CI/CD pipelines and testing and all of these things, a lot of people still don't like shipping on Fridays. But there are still deadlines, right? We still need to get stuff out for our customers, our users, our internal stakeholders, whoever's got a vested interest in this feature or bug being created or fixed. We still have product managers back then, when security was an issue or a task, who would say, you know what, we'll do the security thing next week. Let's just get it out of the door. Let's just get it running. Let's make our users happy. And then next week, there would be more things to work on. And they're like, oh, well, we can do that later. It was always pushed back because it was this concrete thing that we thought about. We thought about security as a thing that had to be done to our code. And then Bruce Schneier, who's big in the security world, he wrote an essay back in 2000, and he talked about security as a what was the term he used? It was security as a process, I think. And that didn't really become part of. I first started that really being implemented in in the real world, in the projects that I was working on, probably about 10 years after he first coined the term, 2010, 2012 maybe. And the idea there was that it's built into the work, like you have to write your code. And the principle was great in that now, instead of having a feature and then having to make it secure, I had a feature that had to be secure from the outset. And that one ticket isn't completed until it's secure, or at least like security principles have been applied, right? And while the idea was great, with the implementation of that, I feel was always going to be on a back foot. It was never really going to be able to get ahead, because what happens now is I, as a software engineer, get this task and I have to make sure that security principles are applied, but I still have that deadline. The product manager is still going to come to me and say, we have to ship this on Friday. Now I've got a task that might take 8 hours, but I've only got 4 hours to do it. So I do what I can, right? I write the feature, takes 4 hours. I'm like, well, I don't have time to do the security. So now I, as an individual developer, have to make the decision to not include the security, and there's nothing representative of that security requirement in the backlog anymore. So suddenly I've taken it out and nobody in the team necessarily knows. So now we have this black hole where security isn't being applied, not because I don't care about it, but because the time pressures are still there. So I think what it really comes down to, I think the number one thing that developers can do to make their code more secure is you don't need to know everything inside out, but keep looking into, like, get familiar with the OWASP top 10. That's a hard one to say, isn't it? OWASP top 10. Get familiar with that. The OWASP project also has a number of cheat sheets and various other resources that you can look at. And there are various other projects as well. If you're working in particularly APIs, they've got an API project as well. So have a look at all the things. So OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project. So if you're working in web applications, and even to a certain extent non-web-based applications, there's a lot of stuff in there that can just give you an idea of the kind of things that you should probably understand at a conceptual level. And then, and here's the key part, is making sure that your product manager understands not the in-depth stuff, but the implications. Here's what we're doing, here's what could go wrong, and here's the outcome of that. Always talk about business outcomes. What would happen as the product manager? What would happen if we don't have the time to focus on this security and there's an SQL vulnerability that allows somebody to export all the data about our customers? Like, phrase it in ways that make others in the organization outside of the technical field understand what the implications are, because if you can get buy-in from the company that security is something you should focus on, that makes your life a lot easier to start with. But then, of course, once you've got that buy-in, now you've got to do the actual work.
So yeah, I'm curious about what ArcJet does, because I'm, as an application developer, I always welcome services that can speed up my adoption. So what's the core service, and how does it benefit developers?
Sure. So we've got a number of tools or primitives that we provide. We have a rate limiting service. So normally, if you wanted to add rate limiting to your web application, you'd either do it within the one server. You'd be able to store information about users within the context of a server and then rate limit there. But say, for example, I access your web application from my laptop, which is connected to my home Wi-Fi internet service provider, but I also connect to your app from my phone, which is going via a cell tower. So I've got different IP addresses. One of them could be via a VPN or something. So it could even potentially be appearing to come from 2 different locations. I've now got 2 different rate limits. So you might want each user to have a certain rate limit. You might want it to apply across multiple services. Maybe you've scaled your application horizontally, and you want to make sure that each application in totality gives you a certain rate limit. So these are the kind of things that can be done with ArcJet, because we run inside your application. So we've got the context of your what's happening in the application as opposed to at the network layer, to be able to provide more flexibility around how you implement that rate limiting. We also do things like bot protection, similar kind of concept, because we're sitting inside your application. We're able to do a lot more nuanced checks to see whether or not it's a bot hitting your application, but then also what you do with that information. One of my friends at Permit, who are the access control as a service company, He actually used ArcJet the other day not to detect and block a bot, but to detect a bot because he wanted to give bots a certain permission level. So actually being able to use that as an input to another system is a really interesting way of using it. We've got a product called Shield, which will do cross-site vulnerability detection, SQL injection, all these kind of things within your application. And essentially, we've also just released a redaction primitive, actually. So you can say, here's a lump of text. Can you please take out or detect if there's email addresses or phone numbers or credit cards or these kind of things, which is particularly useful when you're getting information from your users in real time and pushing it out to an LLM, for example, where you don't want personally identifiable information to be sent to third parties. So you can use the redaction primitive to detect potentially sensitive information in any of the payloads you have, or maybe you're pulling information out of a database and you know that that data hasn't been sanitized. You can use it for those kind of things.
I think it's a very, very interesting product, to be fair. I've been taking a quick look, and it's really the kind of thing that I think will accelerate development of the product. Like, I have I'm a solution architect. I work very, very closely with startups. People were doing some kind of, they're just starting using SignalWire and various APIs and whatever. And I see people cut a lot of corners. So this is where you'd really want to. This is where you'd really want to start. It's a lot that you usually don't think about, like just bot protection, that kind of stuff, and some of the cross-site scripting, etc. It's usually built in modern frameworks, but not the rest.
Sure. One of the advantages with doing some, I mean, you could do the blocking within your system as well, but one of the advantages with the vulnerability attack detection in ArcJet is that once a particular fingerprint of a user, now typically if you don't tell us anything about the user, we'll use an IP address, which is a rough analog to what is a user. We know it's not a real analog, but if you say, for example, we've set a cookie with this user and here's the ID, then you can fingerprint based on that. So now if somebody comes in and starts issuing cross-site scripting attacks, ArcJet can actually block that user from any future requests as well, even if they're not cross-site scripting attacks. So yes, the frameworks are a great level. They do brilliant work in terms of, especially when you're using things like ORMs for database interaction, they will eliminate a lot of the concerns with SQL injections. There are a lot of things you can do at the business logic layer, but one of the advantages of putting something like ArcJet in as middleware to your application is before the rest of your business logic even gets hit, it can determine whether or not the request should even run. So not only are you reducing the load on your server because you're not running code that then potentially looks for injection attacks, but you're actually removing future load from a particular client. So that could be like a curl bot or even somebody doing something malicious through a web browser. If you can stop any future requests, that's going to impact positively your other users because they're not going to be impacting your services, rather than letting the information flow all the way through and then having the framework protect your database from that SQL injection attack. You can stop it before that even happens.
I think that's a very good. I like the idea of fingerprinting, etc. There's a couple open source projects that run along that line, but not at this level and not on this type of precision. Right. And I feel like security has become a very important topic at all levels. Like everything has gotten worse, to be honest. Like we did a demo at ClueCon this last summer in August, where I was doing a FreeSwitch. It's an open source telephone server training session. And at the end, what we did was I spun up a fresh container with a new IP address and waited to see how long it would start getting scans from malicious users trying to exploit the usual, since it has a web server built in, you see all those things like, WordPress has some bugs where if you have the right URL, you get the password file, or if you don't have the right permissions, you get whatever protected content. It took us 2 minutes to start getting scans, and in 10 minutes, we were getting over 10 scans a second. It was insane. Granted, it's a public DigitalOcean IP address, so this is probably the single most scanned group of IP addresses, but it's terrible. So people need to really need to be super super careful, and it's an investment that pays off if you're running a startup. Like it's a no-brainer that especially if you get well, since you're in the space, what are the most common attacks you're seeing recently, and what are
So
people after?
strangely, or maybe not so strangely, the biggest attack vector is still injection attacks. If you look at the OWASP top 10, they had a new version for 2021, and I don't remember what the top two are. But number 3, it used to be back in. I should probably pull this up so I can actually give some.
Nice,
some
yeah.
OWASP top 10. Let's see if we can find this. So they released a new version in 2021, I believe. They're working on one at the moment for next year. So they're going to bring out a new OWASP top 10 next year. So we have here in 2017, the last time, the previous version of the top 10, injection attacks were number 1. Now they've gone down to number 3, and they've actually consolidated cross-site scripting attacks and injection attacks into one attack categorization, which kind of makes sense because cross-site scripting is injecting into HTML ostensibly, whereas injection itself, I think they were looking mostly at SQL queries. Now above that is broken access control and cryptographic failure. But in terms of so those are the things that we're most worried about at the moment. But in terms of most attacks from the research I did just about a month ago is still on the injection side of things. And I think that's because it's one of those things that is
Why?
easy to automate. Like you can have scripts just running out there trying to attack things, whereas trying to break cryptographic failure, trying to break broken access control is a bit more nuanced. So in terms of the number of attacks, injection seems to be the one that we're still seeing the most about, even though it's considered to be the 3rd highest risk. Of course, if you're anywhere in the top 10, you should be looking at that risk, no matter where it lies in priority. But yeah, injection
Right,
attacks.
it makes sense. It makes sense because even if it's something that's relatively well handled by modern frameworks, like injection shouldn't be a thing almost at all. All you need is one place where it's not handled properly, and it's easy to do a million tests an hour just to see what happens.
So one thing, and I was thinking exactly the same thing around about a month when I was doing this research. I was basically writing a new talk about the top 10 ways or top 10 tips to writing secure websites, that kind of thing. And I was thinking, why is it that with all the latest ORMs and modern frameworks that we still have these issues? And the reason is not everybody's using them. We still have a whole lot of legacy applications out there that are still vulnerable. We have people who will start applications. There's a big, not big, it's probably a bit of hyperbole. There is a tendency for some people to choose to not go for a framework because they want to write something really light. If your target audience has all got a really good internet connection and a good computer, which with enough grunt, then modern web frameworks are great. Because remember, things like React and Angular and Vue and all of these front-end applications run on the browser of your users. So, but if your customers are living in places where the internet isn't so good, or maybe they don't have access to the latest computers, or they're not able to afford the latest computers, then the impact of that means that your application is going to run more slowly because of your customer's computer, not because of your application or where you're hosting it and those kind of things. So there is still a consideration around there about whether or not the full aspect of a modern framework should be used. So not every application has those protections. And I think it's easy for developers, especially developers who, I don't know, follow podcasts like this one or go to conferences, or they're always looking for the latest fun thing. We're always tinkering with
you're trying to go fast. You're trying to
React development for a while now, but Astro came out. I'm like, I'm going to give it a try. I haven't used it for anything in production yet, but it's fun to try these things. And with that mindset, I'm always thinking about what's the latest and greatest. And I forget that not everybody has that luxury. Not all companies have the luxury of being able to use the latest framework, either because of red tape. Banks, for example, are notoriously slow at catching up with the latest in technology because there's a risk in doing that. Some people, as I said, won't do that because their end customers can't run that in their environment very effectively. So there are lots of reasons why there's still applications out there that are vulnerable. And we need to remember that, as well as making sure that the new frameworks that we use also keep us safe.
There's also a lot of development, especially in client side, which can still expose you to issues, is done through complex JavaScript frameworks that not you don't have full understanding of. Like the
Right.
dependency stack is 30 levels deep, and
Mhm.
who knows what's those packages. Like
Right.
it happens weekly that especially JavaScript. JavaScript very
Mhm.
popular, so that's why.
Sure.
Especially in JavaScript, it happens weekly that we get an alert where this seemingly harmless package actually is trying. It will steal all as a keylogger in it. And recently there
Totally.
was some kind of UI package on npm that was actually doing key logging of anything that was being typed in the browser. It
Yeah.
was insane.
So that's probably another really good tip. Is some things, and my first advice how to write more secure code is try and automate as much as possible. So putting something like ArcJet into your application is an easy win. It's a couple of lines of code. For most people, it's actually completely free, and that will protect your application up to a certain point. Using things like modern frameworks, if you can, if it's suitable for your customer market, using an ORM to connect to databases. These are all things that we can do in terms of software. But there are other things we can do as well. We can use CI/CD pipelines that are automatically testing, as you say, our dependencies. GitHub's Dependabot is good for that. There's socket.dev. They've got not only do they have a service that can plug into your CI/CD pipeline to test your application against to see whether there are any vulnerabilities, but I have their browser plugin installed. So when I go to npmjs.org to have a look at an npm package, it'll actually tell me on the page what socket.dev thinks about this package. And it'll look into things like how many different people have not contributed to it, but published the package itself. Because it can be a bit of a tell if it's been published by one user for a while and then suddenly somebody else publishes it. It's like, well, maybe there's a vector there. It does not necessarily mean it's bad. It's a flag, right? It'll actually evaluate the package to see if it does any network requests, and it'll tell you about those things. So maybe it didn't used to, and now you realize that I'm going to pick on LeftPad because that's the age-old joke, right?
Oh yeah.
if LeftPad is suddenly making HTTP requests, you're thinking, but why? So that could be a data exfiltration avenue. So it's a really good tool to have there. Again, the plugins, the browser plugin is totally free, and it gives you that heads up without you having to think about it every time. You go and look at an npm package, and you're thinking, okay, how do I use this? And then suddenly there's a warning alert comes up saying, hey, you should consider this as medium risk because of, and then it'll outline a few things. So using tools that will automatically alert you as to potential issues is another, that's probably step number 2, right?
There are a couple very good packages, softwares you can run on your computers too. Like I use Little Snitch on Mac, which is another of those kind of application firewalls that will tell you, hey, this application is doing these requests. Is that okay? Is that something it's not supposed to do? Whatever. And it's really it's been really valuable for a lot of cases. So
yeah, I think often it can feel a bit annoying. I just released a new example code onto the ArcJet repository, I don't know, about 2-3 weeks ago. And because it was a new framework, it was basically one of the example apps in, I think it might have been Svelte, I can't remember which one. But because I had to install a whole load of new packages that had never been on that repository before because of Svelte, socket.dev in the GitHub pull request came up with all these things. Hey, these are all new packages. You should investigate them. Tell me if they're okay to let through. If you want to go ahead and merge this PR. And it's annoying to get those things. It happens every now and then. It doesn't happen every time. But like with Little Snitch, do you want this application to be able to do X, Y, and Z? It becomes annoying, and sometimes there can be this whole automatically click yes, just proceed. So we can get into a change sometimes with these applications of being a bit too annoying. But yes, if at all possible when using these, try to remember that it's not trying to annoy you. It's just trying to help you in the best way that it can. And if the best way it can is just to give you a little annoying alert every now and then actually consider what it's telling you and work out whether or not that's a security risk. Because that's the other thing, is sometimes just apathy or busyness or when you're programmed to automatically click the yes button, all of these things can in themselves introduce a security vulnerability.
Well, by itself, the package vulnerabilities we discussed really are a perfect example of how people can easily get into trouble with just not paying attention.
Which is why there's a
I've
lot
been using
of people nowadays
I've been
also
using this
saying
library for a
zero
week.
dependency. A lot of people are writing without dependencies at all, or trying to, because of that risk.
Yeah, I've been using this library for weeks, so why should it matter? And
Right, exactly. Hasn't been a problem yet.
yeah, and then you've not until it is.
Right, exactly.
Until it is. Good. So, well, I think this is a very good starting point. Again, I really recommend taking a look at ArcChat. I really like the homepage. I'm gonna literally test it in an application I'll be building in the next couple of weeks. So
Nice.
and there's a free tier that has all the services. Honestly, I feel like it's a very good free tier. It's very generous.
Yeah.
And
so the principle with that is that we want to protect people's applications. So if you get like a DDoS attack, for example, and we started charging you for that, that kind of goes against the whole point of protecting yourself, because a lot of the cost, a lot of the protections around cost as well. We've heard of people have surprise bills from platforms or service providers because they suddenly got a DDoS attack and now they've got a $120,000 bill. We want to try and help against that as well. So, but that would be really hard if we then charged you for having being DDoSed. So things like rate limiting and shield and like we've got an email validation checker and these kind of things. We want those to be free anyway, and then we charge for things like enterprise level functionality, so that any developer can pick this up now, put it into their MVP, into their side project or whatever, and not worry about having to pay for ArcChat in the future. But then if you use it in a larger application or a larger environment like an enterprise, then there are options for extra functionality at a cost.
Of course. Well, then go check out ArcChat. And well, Ben, thank you so much. Security is always an important topic, and we really touched on a few things, including injection still being the most important vulnerability.
Who knew?
You wouldn't believe. I mean, until you told me, I hadn't noticed. But you're right.
Yeah.
And other very important topics. So, well, Ben Dechrai joining us today, developer advocate ArcChat. There will be links in the description. Reach out to him. Go check out ArcChat, and let me know if you like this. So, thank you for joining us, Ben.
Thanks, Luca. And thanks, everybody, for joining us.
And for the rest of the people, I'll see you next week. Goodbye.